Innovations in media have changed over the past few months. Globally, we've had to adapt to the changes that COVID-19 has forced upon us. Internews South Africa has done research on the freedom of expression under lockdown, as well as the role of the media. For more on this, we're joined by Teldah Mawarire, migration specialist at Internews South Africa. Thank you very much, Teldah, for joining us. Let's start with the purpose of the research. What were you looking for specifically?
Afternoon, Dudu. Can I just start with a correction that the report was done under the Advancing Rights in Southern Africa program, of which Internews is a consortium, as well as other organizations such as Freedom House, American Bar Association, and PACT. So they are the owners of the research.
Thank you very much for that. What is it that you were looking for?
So with this particular report, we were looking at the effects of COVID-19 on freedom of expression because, you know, COVID-19 has affected a lot of things. So we were looking at, in particular, at that right, freedom of expression and access to information to say what has been the situation for individual citizens as well as for the media under COVID-19. So I don't know if I can go into a few findings of this research.
Please do. You were looking at 8 countries in the SADC region, the overall picture.
So yes, yeah, we looked at 8 countries in SADC, including Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, amongst other countries, Lesotho and Eswatini. And the results that we found of the research is things such as the laws and policies that have been adopted by a lot of governments in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of them are overreaching and, you know, they violate freedom of expression and are not necessary, such as clauses such as those on fake news, clauses such as on sourcing of information by journalists. Other findings that we found is that there's a lot of censorship amongst journalists that happened during COVID-19 as a result of fear of these laws and policies that were adopted, these state of emergencies and so forth. Another finding we made personally about journalists is that a lot of journalists have suffered trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder sort of syndromes is what we found in the research amongst journalists as a result of stress and as a result of being frontline workers. Although, you know, in most of the COVID policies of government, journalists are not being considered as frontline workers. We also found media houses are under immense pressure because of the pandemic and the lockdowns that ensured. The sort of pressure is financial. Advertising streams have dwindled down, especially print media. And we found in South Africa, especially some print media has started closing, and this is not unique to the region. In other countries that have got economic challenges, such as Zimbabwe and Malawi, we found journalists complained a lot about not having protective clothing and sometimes having to access isolation centers without having protective clothing from their media houses, often who said they could not afford. And then we found that there was an upsurge in the use of social media, so those who can express themselves in social media. But for media houses, this upsurge in terms of numbers of followers, they've not been able to monetize it. And then lastly, we also found in this research that, you know, minority groups in society, so minority groups such as women, indigenous persons, and women in rural areas have not been able to access the media during the lockdown. There was an issue of language, there was an issue of media being unable to travel to far-flung areas. And as a result, their voices were not heard in the media and they were not able to express themselves. And the result of that is that those who are not able to express themselves are not able to capture the attention of governments. So if they're not able to capture the attention of governments, then policies and other sort of mechanisms that are adopted by governments to respond to COVID-19 left out these important and vulnerable groups. So these are amongst some of the findings that we found that we did find something positive as well, that
before we get into the positive, we will in a moment.
Yes.
I'd like us to perhaps look at the stifling of freedom of expression and the work of the media. In terms of countries that we saw doing this, the most of the 8 that you looked at, who are the worst performers?
Well, I would say, you know, countries where freedom of expression has been difficult already, it became more difficult during it has become more difficult during the COVID-19. So countries such as Zimbabwe, we've seen an increased arrest of Zimbabwe. I think the Committee to Protect Journalists has cited Zimbabwe as having the most number of journalists arrested during the COVID-19 pandemic for various reasons, reporting on corruption, movement of journalists. They had to go to court for them to be declared as essential workers. There are other countries which were worrisome as well, such as Botswana, which under its regulations, there were not so many violations, but a lot of censorship. There was also the issue of Eswatini as well, where already it was a difficult environment for the media. And now with the COVID pandemic, there has been a misuse, if you like, of the COVID rules, and also increased fear amongst journalists to report, for example, on people in government or people around the king or the king himself when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa, which is usually cited in the region as a better case when it comes to, freedom of expression and media, also did have some worrisome cases that came up, violations of journalists during the lockdown rules, inability to access courts and so forth. So I would say that's kind of like the ranking. Those who have been worst, it just became exacerbated under the pandemic.
And very quickly for us, perhaps, the positives that the research found.
We found some new innovations in media, especially. So in South Africa and in Botswana, there have been 2 publications that have been born out of the pandemic. And these are mostly publications that are distributed for free digitally, such as, The Continent by the Mail and Guardian. There's the Sniff Dog in Botswana, which is also a new initiative. So those were some of the positives that we also found.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Teldah Mawarire from Internews South Africa.